Our saints and children tell how hearts learn to forgive. Built of hopes and dreams and visions, rock of faith and vault of grace. Here the love of Christ shall end divisions. All are welcome, all are welcome, all are welcome in this place. Let us build a house where prophets speak and words are strong and true, where all God's children dare to seek to dream God's reign anew. Here the cross shall stand as witness and a symbol of God's grace. Here as one we claim the faith of Jesus. All are welcome, all are welcome, all are welcome in this place.
Well, good morning and welcome again to a program of the Voice of the Faithful, New Jersey. I am really pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Bishop John Stowe, a native of Ohio and a conventual Franciscan, was appointed Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky in 2015 by Pope Francis. When I invited him to speak to us, I mentioned to him that I was familiar with conventual Franciscans because I attended a high school in New Jersey staffed by faculty of something like 44 of them, although from different provinces. That was before Vatican Council, of course, in a different era. I think there were 3 lay people in the school: the gym teacher, the football coach, and the typing teacher. All the rest were Franciscans. But they were mostly good guys. And I think the Pope knew exactly what he was doing when he appointed John Stowe as a bishop. He has a history of working on social justice and peace issues, including becoming a member of the board and president of Pax Christi, national Catholic organization devoted to peace and nonviolence. Before becoming a bishop, he served in El Paso, Texas, a border town, so he's well aware of the migrant issues. More recently, he was selected by Pope Francis to be one of the United States representatives to the Synod on Synodality, which met in Rome last year and will meet again next year. And that brings us to today's topic, the Synod in today's context. It's a meeting of the universal church, lay people, religious, bishops, and cardinals to wrestle with issues facing the church today and look to the future. Depending on where you live in this country, you may have been exposed to the Synod through a parish, or you may not have been. We in Voice of the Faithful have had an opportunity to participate in small groups on Zoom through our Votive National. So I very much appreciate Bishop John taking time this afternoon to talk about synodality, especially since the synod in his diocese is going on just as we speak, something that we don't know about here. We've asked the bishop to speak for 30 minutes or so, and then take another half hour or so for questions and discussions. So Bishop John, thank you so much for being with us. And we are very welcome and very, very happy to listen to you.
Thank you, Leo, and thanks to all of you in Voice of the Faithful. You've given so much to the church, especially your perseverance and your willingness to work for a better church. So I admire all of you and what you're doing through that organization and your interest in the Synod. And Leo, I need to set the record straight on something. I was not a delegate in Rome. I was on the USCCB team all the way up to the continental level, but I was not elected to go to Rome. So just to set that straight, but I've been following it very closely. So if you want to throw me out now, it's okay. The word synod is not yet a household word for us Catholics. You know, our Eastern brothers and sisters, whether Orthodox or in the Udiate churches, the Eastern Rite churches of the Catholic Church, are very familiar with that language. They're used to having decisions made in a collegial way that we in the West are not so familiar with. And the synod is Pope Francis's desire to add synodality as part of the makeup of the church. In fact, he is completely convinced that this is what the church in our time needs, and it's what is God's will for the church. And I think we have to take him seriously at that. And he has done something that no Eastern church has yet done, and that is to expand the participation in the synod beyond that of bishops. So even the office of the synod, which used to be called the office of the Synod of Bishops, is now the office of the synod. And as we witnessed this last October, when the Paul VI audience hall, that massive space in Vatican City, they took out all the theater seating and placed round tables on the floor. And the Pope, along with 359 other delegates, sat at round tables and discussed with each other the issues that had been presented from the diocesan level, from the regional level, from national levels and continental levels, as issues that are in the hearts and minds of people as we strive to understand what is the Spirit saying to us now as to how we should be the church going forward. Now, I don't know about you, and I see many of you, I can at least guess from your appearance that many of you were around before Vatican II and know something about the before and after reality of the Second Vatican Council. I just recently had the experience for the first time ever of asking a group what comes to mind when they think of Vatican II, and nobody had a clue. They had no idea. So I'm beginning to show my age as well because they couldn't answer it. One person thought Vatican II must be where the Pope goes for his vacations, the Second Vatican. Now, I thought that was terrible, but it reminds us that we have to re-educate our church about the Second Vatican Council. If you remember, those of you who can remember, when John the 23rd was elected Pope, the cardinals were trying to figure out who's going to follow Pius XII. And Pius XII, as you can picture in your imagination, was thin, was scholarly, was diplomatic, had his round glasses, looked like an intellectual. He wasn't often, in the media or anything else. He had a strict approach to how he ran the papal office, and he led the church through the Second Vatican Council, through the Second World War. And we will forever debate what he could have done or might have done differently at that time. But we can also remember that even the Jewish community awarded him substantial awards for what he did to rescue Jewish people and get them to safety from Italy. Putting that aside, I think there's a lot of parallels between John the 23rd, who was elected to be kind of a bench keeper after the long pontificate of Pius XII, and the cardinals who elected him got more than they bargained for. John the 23rd was an older man by those standards. He was rather roly-poly. He was proud of his agrarian background and happy to be called a peasant and to be known as a farmer's son. And sometimes that belied a much deeper thinker, a much more developed intellect, and somebody rich in experience who was ideally placed to call the Second Vatican Council. John the 23rd had been the head of the propagation of the faith in the whole country of Italy. He had served as a nuncio in Bulgaria, where he discovered the Orthodox Church and had to wonder, why are we separate when we have so many things in common? Especially when he had the challenging job of trying to arrange permission for somebody from the royal family of Bulgaria who were Orthodox to marry somebody from the royal family of Italy who were Catholic. And he just said, this is way too complicated. Having gained some experience with the Orthodox, he was sent to Istanbul or Constantinople, the worldwide headquarters of the Eastern Church, and then found out that the population there is over 95% Muslim. So with the experience of the Orthodox, he had to learn all over again about how to dialogue with Muslims whom he knew very little about. Then after that, he was sent to the plum assignment, which was Paris, and he was eager to get out of that one. And when he finally went to Venice as patriarch, he said, now I can be a parish priest. Well, not exactly, but it was the closest he ever got. And even the first day he went to Venice and was interviewed by the press, something his predecessors never did, he said he couldn't wait to go to the Venice Film Festival. Little did he know that his predecessor had said any Catholic that went to the Venice Film Festival would be excommunicated. So he indicated by his own personality that something different was happening in the church. Now, fast forward to Francis, who looks a little bit like John the 23rd, who smiles a lot like John the 23rd, who kind of was portrayed as somebody who wasn't as sophisticated, and I should have known better. He's a Jesuit. Of course, he's got an education. But we have a very similar Pope who was elected in a similar fashion, and the cardinals who elected him to clean up the Curia probably got more than they bargained for, because he's done much more than clean up the Curia. Now, some of us might be frustrated with the slow pace of things. Some of us want things to go faster. Some of us think he's running out of time and wonder who's coming next after him. But I'm pretty convinced that his greatest gift to the church will be this synod process and this hope and goal of synodality. We call Pope Francis the first post-conciliar pope. Now, I have to explain that because we've had other popes since the council, obviously. But if we go back to John the 23rd, who called the council and then died in the midst of it, was succeeded by Paul VI, who had to decide whether to continue or not the council and was completely in favor of continuing it. And then at his death in 1978, John Paul I was elected, lived 33 days, but he intentionally chose the names of both John and Paul to indicate his desire to keep going in that conciliar style. And then after 33 days, Karol Wojtyła was elected as John Paul II, who also said he would honor his predecessor, John Paul I, and would continue the vision of the Second Vatican Council. Are you familiar with the theologian and historian Massimo Fagioli? At least know that name. He teaches at Villanova in Pennsylvania. Massimo Fagioli said he calls John Paul II's approach to Vatican II as Vatican II nominalism. That means that John Paul II, who was present at the council, who was a bishop at the council, who was already influential at the council and very much engaged in the drafting of some of the documents of the council, decided that his vision of the council was the vision of the council. And so Fagioli calls it nominalism in the sense that whatever he named as fruits of the council, he expected the church to agree that these were fruits of the council. So he said that about a lot of the lay movements, whether it's the neo-catechumenal way, or whether it's Comunione, Liberazione in Italy, or Focolari, or any of these groups, he called them all fruits of the council. And he also started this discussion about following the letter of the council more than the spirit of the council. Now, we know that he was assisted in the Vatican by his close colleague, Joseph Ratzinger, who was a priest and an expert theologian at the council and also very influential. But at that time, Ratzinger was considered one of the progressives. By the time he runs the doctrine of the faith for more than a decade and then is elected as Benedict XVI, his approach to the council was markedly different than his predecessor. in that John Paul II always spoke positively about the council, whereas Benedict XVI always qualified any optimism about the council. He said the council, as far as it went, was good, but then things went wrong. It was something that he regularly said. And he gave the clarity that he thought was, absolute teaching, was that the letter of the council is the work of the Spirit, but the spirit of the council is working against the good of the church. Now, he resigns from office, clearly unable to hold on to the authority, and didn't have the energy or the ability to lead the church at a time when there was lots of infighting and other problems in the Curia. And Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected from the cardinals after giving one of the conclave homilies in which he talked about Jesus knocking at the door. Now, we've heard that image used before. We find that image in the book of Revelation, but Jorge Mario Bergoglio gave it a different twist. He said it was Jesus on the inside of the church knocking on the door saying, "Let me out. You're suffocating me." And he talked about how we had lost our missionary impulse and were too focused on internal matters that don't matter to the world around us. And so he's the first pope that wasn't actually at the council at that time, but has taken the council teaching seriously. And as he said when he stepped out on the balcony on that day in March in 2013, he announced to the world that they have gone to the ends of the earth to find a bishop of Rome. So he used the conciliar language of speaking about the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. When he said goes to the ends of the earth, he was literally true, speaking about Argentina, but he's also introduced a word in our Catholic vocabulary called periphery, those who are on the edges, those who are on the margins. And he's made it a priority in his pontificate to bring those on the periphery to the center. And with him came all of the experience of the Latin American church, particularly the Latin American Conference of Bishops, which is more than a national conference. It's a continental conference that gave us the language of preferential option for the poor, that gave us the language of missionary disciples, and that witnessed a whole continent that had been aligned with the crown originally, and then with the powerful, even dictators, through most of the century down to the 20th century, and then took a magnificent change of direction and opted to be on the side of the poor. And that was transformative in the Latin American church. So when the cardinals elected Bergoglio, they were electing that whole experience that he brings with him. In addition to that, they elected a Jesuit, with the educational background that he had, but also with a formation deeply rooted, deeply steeped in discernment. That was not a big word in the church. It's still not a big word, unfortunately, in seminaries, because too often seminarians think discernment is about whether they should get into the seminary and then whether they should be ordained. But Pope Francis has talked about pastoral leaders having to discern constantly the direction of the church and having to accompany people in their own discernment. And the U.S. church has not known what to do with that direction. And so we've paid little attention to the teachings of Francis all along. And we paid little attention to the synod up until this point, unfortunately. Now, I think Francis has added a number of words to our vocabulary because of his own priorities, but I hope, and mercy would be a key one, because he talks about that as a name of God and one of the most important attributes of God. He talks about participation and inclusion, even to the point of saying that we have to change the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," and add to it now, "Thou shalt not exclude," because exclusion in our world means death. He's given us the encyclicals on the environment with Laudato Si that we have paid not enough attention to. And then he gave us just this last year, Laudate Deum, saying what's happened in 9 years, not enough. Climate change is accelerating. He gave us Fratelli Tutti, this beautiful vision of the gospel, how we're all supposed to be brothers and sisters. But where he sees this acted out is in the synod. And so in that hall, the Paul VI auditorium in Rome, where people are sitting around round tables, men and women were voting for the first time, not in proportionate numbers, but it's a first. Non-bishops are voting for the first time, not in proportionate numbers, but it's a first. That takes it even further than the Eastern churches have ever done. Now, talking about that, I think one of the key things I don't hear many people talking about in terms of the synod was when Patriarch Bartholomew, who's the head of the Eastern Church, the Patriarch of Constantinople, when he addressed the Synod of Bishops in 2008, which is before Francis was elected, he addressed the Synod of Bishops at their invitation. He was a guest, he was an outsider, but he reminded them that John Paul II had written an encyclical called Ut Unum Sint, that we may be one. And you could boil down that encyclical to saying that the papacy is the main thing that keeps us from being one church, East and West. And in Ut Unum Sint, John Paul II asked theologians and church leaders from other Christian denominations, especially the Orthodox, to be creative in imagining how the Petrine ministry, that is the successor of Peter, might be exercised in a more ecumenical church. Patriarch Bartholomew took John Paul II, who had already, he took John Paul II, whose encyclical was in the past, but brought it back to the foreground, and he suggested that if the Eastern Church and the Western Church were ever to be reconciled, the Western Church would have to balance primacy with synodality. And I really think that's where the seed was planted. Patriarch Bartholomew was the first Patriarch of Constantinople to be at a papal installation for Francis. The gospel at that installation mass was proclaimed in Latin and in Greek, representing East and West. The Patriarch and Francis have become good friends and have issued joint documents and have together created the season of creation, beginning September 1st, when the Orthodox begin a new lectionary and a new cycle of readings with the story of Genesis and creation, and ending on October 4th, the feast of Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of creation. So I think these two have shared a vision, and Francis wants to take this and make it his lasting contribution to the structure of the church so that we might walk together into the future. He reminds us that the word synod itself, synodos, has to do with being on the way together. He reminds us that the Second Vatican Council's preferred image for the church was the people of God, but sometimes we forget the adjective that was used, the pilgrim people of God, on the way to something greater. When he called this synod, very much like when John the 23rd started talking about the idea of a council and made the whole curia apoplectic, every time he brought up the idea of a council, they told him there was no need for such a thing. And every time they tried to resist him, he moved up the date and thought, well, it's going to be here tomorrow if we don't stop resisting this. So they let it happen. Something similar happened with the synod and Pope Francis. John the 23rd said, we're going to have a council. And the curia said, about what? And he said, aggiornamento, updating things. We don't have a council to update things. Well, we need a council to update things. And he pulled it off, and look at the results. Even for those who haven't heard of it or don't remember it at all, we do have, for the most part, Mass in our own language and with the priest engaging in face-to-face dialogue with the people and with God. We have the scriptures being studied by Catholics and incorporated in the liturgy in a greater amount. We have ecumenical relations. We have an ecclesiology that sees baptism as the foundational sacrament, not orders. But so many things have happened that can't be reversed from the council. So even those who don't understand it, know about it, or appreciate it, are benefiting from its fruits. Now, Francis is saying we have to go further. He's trying to, at the same time, decentralize the papacy so that local decisions can be made on a local level. But in order to do that, he doesn't want to create princedoms all over the church in every diocese, but create processes where people can come together, discuss, and pray over things together. So the methodology that he's given us is really rooted in his Ignatian spirituality. And the process that was used in Rome in October was called Conversations in the Spirit. It was a process of discernment, of listening, of sharing with each other how what they said resonates, and then compiling what was heard all together. That's a slow-moving process. And for those of us in the West who are much more pragmatic, we want to know where things are going. And so many of our bishops use the excuse, well, we don't know how to present the synod because we don't know where it's going. And Pope Francis would say, well, that's up to the Holy Spirit. I'm not the one in charge of this. The Holy Spirit is the protagonist. Now, if we really believe that, and if we really believe that what happened in the 13th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles is still possible today when the church is so much bigger, and the Pope does believe it, then we have to pay attention to the working of the Spirit in so many different places of the church and hear what the Spirit is inspiring these delegates and others to say to each other. The delegates are there, but they're also processing all that has been heard on all the other levels of the synod up until this point. Now, we in the United States are at somewhat of a disadvantage because we're the only continent, ourselves in Canada, the only continent that didn't have a continental assembly. We only did it by Zoom. And then we had the nerve to say, well, it was too expensive and the territory is too big and there's too many languages to deal with. Africa did it. Asia did it. The Middle East, which is not even a continent, did it in the midst of war and all kinds of other crises. You know, it was possible to do, but we chose not to do it, or at least our bishops chose not to do it. So we're at somewhat of a disadvantage. Still, if we read what was submitted by everybody all over the world, I was in the role of composing, I'll get the word, composing our regional for 22 dioceses in the Southeast, our regional report, and then being part of the national report and part of the continental report. And so I got to see all these different reports from all over, and the common features are so strong that it became clear to me the Holy Spirit is speaking. Everybody everywhere in the world is concerned about how do we keep young people in the church. That's everywhere, right? And everybody all over at different levels in different places, but everybody's worried about being inclusive and how we can make everybody be part of what the church is about and who we are excluding. Everybody's concerned about the role of women. Everybody's concerned about clericalism. And then you mix those things together, it becomes very heated, becomes very complicated. So a term has emerged in the dialogues in the continent and in Rome of co-responsibility. And when you hear co-responsibility or you read it in the report, think about transcending the male-female division and transcending the clerical-lay division. And it really takes us back to baptism being the foundational sacrament and taking seriously the voices of all the baptized. Voice of the faithful and voice of the baptized. Sounds like there's a common agenda there, right? So Francis is building on a principle that says everybody who's affected should be consulted. And that's what he's tried to do. And people like myself can be very frustrated that it's not being carried on at the way it's supposed to be everywhere. Francis is less concerned about that. He says if it were one event in one time, then you could be worried. But this is going to be the way that we go forward in the future. So we'll have several opportunities to get it right. I made it a point when I was in Rome to visit with Cardinal Grech, the prefect of the congregation or the office for the synod. And he's a Maltese bishop who's very close in mind and spirit of Pope Francis. And I wanted him to hear from a bishop that was working on all these things about how I felt they had been taken off track, and how we hadn't followed the directives from Rome, and how we had become more exclusive when we went from the diocesan listening sessions to the national and continental ones. And instead of having representative voices from every part of the church, most of the people that participated in those were chancery employees that answered directly to their bishop, and the bishop signed their paycheck. That was not the spirit. So I wanted to point those things out to him, and he says, we actually got more from the United States than we expected to. And he said, the United States is 7% of global Catholicism, but you're used to having the influence of 93%. And the synod might just change that. Well, that left me with something to think about. And just at the end of February, on the 28th of February, Cardinal Grech was at Notre Dame giving a talk to the bishops of the United States. Maybe 20 of us were there, but he talked about the importance of really being open to the Holy Spirit. And then he emphasized how the laity share in the role of Christ as priest, prophet, and king through baptism, and how we have become so accustomed to that being the three munera of the clerical, three munera of the leadership, that we haven't allowed the laity to really take their part in those roles. And he talked about the importance of allowing the Holy Spirit to be in charge, which is so difficult for us. So I could talk for hours and hours about the synod and what we're getting to. I wanted to highlight the things I don't think are getting a lot of attention in other places. The origins of this and the connection with the Patriarch Bartholomew, how it's so key to the person of Francis and what he brings to the church, and how he sees it as the way forward with no plan B. That we have to be synodal, we have to be listening, and that's one of his key teachings, is that we cannot be a teaching church if we're not first a listening church. That doesn't sound like what you hear from many U.S. bishops. We can't be a teaching church unless we're first a listening church. I think I've used 30 minutes, so let's take the conversation in the direction you all want to go in.
Thank you so much, Bishop Stowe. I think this has been very, very enlightening for us. Massimo Fagioli did precede you as a speaker to this group a couple years ago.
Okay.
Anyway, we will try to, if you just raise your hand, and anyone is welcome to ask the bishop a question or make a comment. Ken.
Bishop, I just loved your talk. It's just so succinct and complete. I was a priest in Rome for 3 of the 4 sessions of the Vatican Council. I was doing canon law of all things. The thing that concerns me most now as a priest, 87 years old, is our younger priests who seem to be, I would say, infected with clericalism. And it troubles me because they are vociferous about it. And I know we want to include parish priests in the synodal process. I think that's very important. It concerns me that there's a strong clerical influence. Could you comment about that?
I could, yes. I've got myself in trouble for commenting on that in the past. I think our seminaries are incubators of clericalism. And unless we're able to use models that religious orders, my own included, have been using, where seminarians go to universities and have to interact with other people, men and women, in circumstances, and then get their formation in addition to the academic courses that they take in school, I think we create too much of an elite, too much of a privileged class. And then Rome thinks we have too many seminaries in the United States. And so the seminaries are struggling to stay alive, and they have to keep the dioceses sending their students there. The dioceses that have less seminarians are more demanding of a rigidity from the seminary staffs. And I think there's a clericalism, and I think it goes parallel with a lack of psychosexual maturity, which is going to be a disaster in the future if we haven't learned anything from the first long series of scandals that we've experienced. So it is a huge issue, and I bring it up every chance I get, but it doesn't get very far in the U.S. Conference of Bishops. I think Rome is going to have to be insistent about reducing the number of seminaries, and I think they're going to have to do another visitation like they did during John Paul's time, when they took women out of formation and reduced the role of women and insisted on the clerical nature and identity as a priest. Well, I think that's gone too far, and now it's time to correct that a little bit. But I share your concern. And these priests are still there in reaction. They're just waiting out Francis. You know, they are still upset about Traditionis Custodes that limits the celebration of the preconciliar Mass, because Francis knows very well the lex orandi, lex credendi, as you pray is how you believe. And those who won't accept the liturgy of the Second Vatican Council are also not accepting of many of his teachings. And where they are is not where the people of God are. So places that where people go to Mass and see the priest facing the altar, or the priest celebrating in preconciliar ways, it's not because the people asked for it. It's because that's what the priest wanted. And then it's not all seminaries, because the seminary rectors will tell you that the priests are getting their formation more from social media and these right-wing groups that are well-funded, and they're the ones who are promoting these agendas that are contrary to Pope Francis. We have seminaries in the United States today where they talk about Francis-free zones, where you're not even allowed to mention the name Francis. So that's kind of a depressing thing, but I wish people who support these seminaries would ask some more questions about what they're contributing to. And I really wish we would look nationally about having fewer seminaries that wouldn't have to compete so much to keep the dollars of bishops there. And then, of course, we need new bishops if we're going to ever get to a Vatican II church in this country. But Francis is working on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's
Anyone else? Bernice. Bernice, you're muted. Bernice.
There she.
I know
Yes,
it's my inability to be technical. I couldn't find the thing. Well, I think what I find is that it's great that we're supposed to be listening and so forth, but the people keep walking out. The younger people keep walking out, and the older people too, because when it comes right down to it, and I guess what they're teaching in the seminaries now is so based on Aquinas, and it's so rigid, and goes back, even if they're not saying it specifically, it goes back to the apple and the who ate the apple and substitutionary atonement and all of those things. Sometimes I think to myself, oh, what did he say? And then I realized what he said. He's really saying that this God is a very fearful person, and that you have to live within these guidelines. And so what happens is people just walk away. You can't move because everything is so rigid. Then again, in these parishes, they didn't take the synod seriously. They didn't publicize it. Most people didn't know anything about it. And as I said, if they did know something about it, they didn't like what happened there, because it goes back to teachings. You get into, I know that they approached LGBTQ people, women priests, not just women deacons, because when you say, oh, well, women could possibly be ordained to the diaconate, you're insulting women, because the reason they should be appointed is not that, oh, we found something in the early church that allowed them to be deacons. No, it's the fact that they're human beings and equal in the sight of God as people, you know. So I find that all of these things, people today are educated and they're not able to put up with this. So again, Ilya Delio, who is at where did you go, Louis? Leo, with Fanjoli, anyway, Villanova. She says the whole thing has to fall. The whole thing has to come down, crash to the bottom, and then, as a plant does, sprouts can come up. So I wonder if you would like to comment on that.
Yes, well, Ilia Delio is a brilliant woman, so I'm not going to argue with her, and she may have a point there. I think Francis finds a lot of hope in many areas of the church, many parts of the world, very different than our own, and has seen what can happen in Latin America. But, you know, he's still slow on the question of women and a number of other things, a number of other issues. So I hope something remains, you know, because I don't know that burning it to the ground is going to do anything if nobody is willing to help build it up again or replant the seeds, or maybe it's all God's work and that's what it's supposed to be to begin with. I don't have a good answer to your point, but I see where you're coming from.
I'd like to say something. Hi, my name is Grace. You were talking about trying to figure out how we could bring our young people back. You know, what is happening with all the people who are leaving? And I can tell you with my children, my son had really worked hard to find a place. He decided to have his children baptized when he could say, we want to belong to that community. And so he waited a long time. My daughter was in the Philadelphia diocese. I probably need to say no more. And so she would bring her children there, and they would see her get so upset and angry at what was going on that she felt that wasn't a place for them then. Myself, that I find a new and very, very common thing that I find if I'm in a church, whether I'm at a funeral or whatever, is when that priest gets up before communion and says, only Catholics in good standing are welcome at the table. I have two choices. I can leave, or I can stand up and yell, like, who are you to say that? I don't know if you're in good standing. Everybody was welcomed at Jesus's table. Everybody of all kinds. Where they get that. Now that I know is keeping young people away. And I always felt that Christmas, Easter, funerals, priests should be at their best in welcoming, because there's so many people there who haven't been there before or for a long time. This is a way to start to bring them back. That doesn't happen. They leave and think, yeah, now I know I'm on, I don't go there, you know? So some of this stuff, I don't know where it came from, why it's so common. I don't know. Did some of these priests never live through, I guess they're too young to have been prior to Vatican II. They have some concept in their minds that there's something wonderful about that, and want to go back to it. So there seems to be a lot of these kind of, they seem small, but they are, I know from my children and their friends that this is keeping them away. They don't feel welcomed, and they don't want their children to feel that way when they're in church. So it's a very sad situation.
Yeah, well, I applaud your son for looking for a place, and I know many people who do that, but it shouldn't be that hard. You know, we should all be able to find access to the Gospels and access to the sacraments the way that Jesus gives them to us.
Charlie?
Yeah, this does not have to turn into a gripe session, but I kind of feel that way. I have come to the point, and I don't think I'm alone, where I believe the priest and maybe in the seminary they should start to learn this. A priest is not a requirement to have a Eucharistic community. All right, it's nice. It's someone to learn from if they know what they're talking about. It's someone who could represent the community, but they are not, in my opinion, necessary to have Eucharist together, to be Eucharistic. And I think possibly if they were taught that, all right, it's nice, you should learn, you should be a leader, you should help the community, but it doesn't depend upon you. That community is going to be there while you're worm food, all right? That community will continue. That community will be Eucharistic because little by little, the ones who don't leave, the ones who stay, are going to say, let's Eucharist together, with or without a priest. And I don't like the sound, I kind of sound pushy, but that's my voice. But that's what I believe. All right. Nice to have a priest, but not required.
I think we might be looking at it differently if priesthood were open to more kinds of people, male and female, married and single. I think we might have the actual role of presbyter the way it was originally envisioned. And you could see the importance of having somebody who's committed to that community and who's there as a full-time servant of that community, but not somebody who pops in and has all the answers until they get moved somewhere else. That's a whole different vision of church. So, but it's what many places have to put up with.
We have just 10 minutes more, and
I think Charles had his hand up before, and I don't know
Me?
who else.
Oh, me.
Peg
Okay.
has a call.
Peg.
I was just wondering if you see any role, Bishop, for small Eucharistic communities as the church is growing. We're part of it. We participate in other Eucharistic communities, but we're not part of an institutional church in the sense of being part of a building.
Yeah, well, in my part of the world, in our diocese, we have lots of very small communities. So we have parishes of 12 and 20 families, and they don't all have a full-time priest. And actually, there are places where I can assign a priest and they don't have enough to do. And I assign a lay person as a parish life director, and there's not enough hours in the day for them to get things done because their vision is much broader about what kind of work they should do. So we have not closed places because there aren't priests. That's the way we've approached it here. And I'm aware of some of those other Eucharistic communities. I don't have that experience to talk about.
You indicated that Pope Francis, and I think we know, is slow on movement towards including women. Is that because of pressure on him, or do you think that's his belief?
I think it's primarily the concern about dividing the church. I think he really wants to avoid a schism, and we've seen it in so many other churches. I think that's what he's most concerned about. He's supposed to be the guarantor of unity, so he gets so much flack over such small things that he's done. Imagine doing something on a much larger scale.
right.
Just giving a blessing to couples, look at the flack he got from, the American bishops.
Yeah.
Just a simple
Cardinal
blessing.
Reinhard Marx is part of the Council of Cardinals that advises the Pope. And he says, they bring up this Council of Cardinals that meets all the time, keep bringing up the women's question. And Francis says, yes, but John Paul II said this was decided once and for all. And Cardinal Marx says that doesn't mean it's going away. So he keeps bringing it up, and I guess others do as well. But I really think it's the fear of schism.
And
I'm back again. If nobody else is, I don't want to hog the thing. Synodality has worked in pockets in the church in the United States, going back to Vatican II. There's a mentor of mine, George Wilson. I don't know, Bishop, if you've ever heard of George.
Sure. Mhm.
George Wilson, Jesuit, but nice.
Yes.
He's been my mentor for over 40 years. And I was a part of their adjunct staff at one point, teaching skills for leadership, collaborative planning. But I was in a parish that I would consider was synodal, and it works.
Mhm.
It works at the most basic level. And people, we had all kinds of people at the table. And I just want to say it works. And enthusiasm is contagious.
Right.
Grace.
I'm a Presbyterian and a grateful guest at these gatherings. I would just like to say that from the beginnings of the Presbyterian Church in the United States, the governance has been democratic. So at the level of presbytery, synod, and general assembly, it's equal numbers of clergy and lay. And I can tell that the Presbyterians could learn from the kinds of discussions that are going on here. And I'm thankful to be part.
Thank you. You know, one of the most interesting synod sessions that I participated on in the national level, when Rome came and told our USCCB team that, you didn't have anything that was ecumenical. So they said, oh, we got to put together a Zoom session that's ecumenical. So they put that together, and there was huge participation. And I ended up in a breakout room with all female bishops from different denominations. So I was the only male in the room and the only Catholic in that room. And it was a fascinating conversation on two levels. One of them was how interested they all are in what we're doing, because they said, we have our own methods of doing things. We're looking at some of the same issues, but we know they can't just be put to a vote. There's got to be a spiritual process or a discernment process. So they're fascinated by that. And then they said, ordaining women doesn't make misogyny go away.
Mm-hmm.
And they had many stories to tell about their own exclusion and what they've experienced along the path. So for me, it was the richest session to participate in.
Oh, wonderful.
Perfect. Are there any other questions or comments? Tish.
Bishop, I was in college in 1962, graduated in 66. When I entered, they asked, do you really want to have the Mass in your language? Shouldn't we stay speaking Latin so that everywhere in the world we will all have the same experience? And I wrote, yes. By 1966, I was ready to sign up for everything that was likely to happen in Vatican II. And I was thoroughly sure that women in leadership would occur. And I was happy to attend a conference. Father Raymond Brown came to Buffalo, and he was, of course, on fire with all the possibilities of what could happen. And he said, and I've never forgotten, and I believe he was absolutely right, and that's what, 55 years ago or something, we won't have parity in the church unless we start out not as women as priests. They should be appointed bishops and stay at the table. Yes, it was so excellent. And I kept thinking it was about to happen. And of course, if I kind of thought about it, the church is glacial. We just happen to be in an avalanche at that point, which is totally unlike everything else. And it is distressing. I want to know how the bishops can look in our particular diocese. In my particular parish setting, we have 2 priests for 8 parishes. And I just thought, if you can't accept women because of the validity of their vocation, would you really allow our churches to be without Eucharist? Surely that could never happen. Well, it is. And how do you look at those areas where it's just a priest shortage that isn't likely to ever be filled? And that's a distress. I think that is just, it's so heartless to me. And I don't know how your bishops handle that.
Sometimes I think the bishops live in a rarefied world where they don't even see that this is happening, or they don't even feel, now they have personnel issues to cover, but I don't think they realize what a local community goes through or how much a single priest can handle when you just keep
That's right.
adding, what's the quality of ministry going to be? But, I've had a wonderful experience with women as parish life directors, and, they can follow the rules and not preach, but they know they get up and preach because that's what has to happen. They animate the community. They break open the word. They do a number of the things that's important for keeping the community together. And they're the ones that are going to be there 7 days a week and where people can turn to. So I think we could be more creative even with the system that we have. And, the sad thing after so many years after the Second Vatican Council is I don't think we realized how strong a hold patriarchy has on our structures. And until we're willing to address that, and really look at what Jesus was doing in his day was, he was challenging those norms. And we have to be bold and let the Spirit guide.
All right, we'll take one more question or comment from anyone. Bernice.
Well, I just want to go back to the Germans because they don't seem to be able to line up with what Rome wants them to do. So I thought, well, is this the first of what Ilya Delio is predicting that the whole thing is going to go? Is this our new way of doing church?
I think the Germans are playing a key role in this. I think they're the ones that are going to keep the goal moving farther and farther out. And even if the Pope has to say they're going too far or whatever, they're the ones raising the questions. And, there's a difference between the episcopacy in Germany and the episcopacy in the United States. The Germans are all theologians. And we don't have theologians in our ranks. We have very few. We have bureaucrats. They have theologians, and I think there's a big difference. So I think the Pope is scolding them and putting them in place, but I also think what they're doing is a necessary role to keep our goals higher and stronger. So maybe I'm naive, but that's my hope in this situation.
Mary, last one. You're muted.
I would just like to say that if they want to evangelize this church, they need more people like you to talk to the people, to talk to us, because no one even talks to us. They just talk at us. And, you're being very open. You're easy to understand in many areas. And it's so refreshing. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking so many things I would like to ask, but there's a time thing. I wish we could talk to you again or somebody else, that feels the way you do, because that's what will bring young people. Young people are not going to come back to what is now. And one more thing, in our churches, we have people that are being educated in seminaries in Poland and Ireland and Colombia and things like that. I feel they're bringing us backwards in some ways, and because of the kind of clericalism we have no say in who is going to be the pastor of a local church. And you might have somebody that's like yourself, and then they get moved, and people go finding somewhere else again because they don't have a home, they feel.
Right.
So
That's
it's
why I
really,
think co-responsibility has been such a theme here, because there has to be more voice in the decisions that are made. In the Eastern churches, although it's only bishops still that are at their meetings, that's where bishops are selected, not through some secret process. It's through the synodal process. Now, if Francis has expanded that, if that could be added, some people are saying that's how the synod needs to be done. That's how the bishops have to be chosen. I think that's part of the vision, but it's been a slow start.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bishop Stowe, I can't begin to thank you for this hour and a half that you spent with us. If I could ask everybody to unmute themselves so that you can hear the applause by letting
Thank
us
you.
spend this Sunday evening and very inspiring.
Thank you.
you.
We wish
Thank
you
you
Thank
for what you all are doing.
Refreshing.
Thank
Just-
you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
You give me hope as well. So thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank
Thank
you.
you for being with us. Thank you for leaving your synod for an hour and a half. I hope they're all in shape when you get back.
It's
And,
getting lively. I'm hearing it getting louder and louder.
I better get back there then.
Maybe
Enjoy
they
it.
voted
Be a
me out
good
of a job.
sign.
I don't know.
That might be a good sign.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you so
Much.
much.
God
Thank you.
bless.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.